Time now for another thrilling edition of Adventures in Radioland. This segment, Hasty Decisions 2, subtitled The German Tank Transmitter. From time to time on our Qso-Vlog network, we discuss the downside of hasty decisions. Now, I don't want to minimize the obvious upside to hasty decisions, but the downside can be far more interesting. Hence, let's move along with the tale of the German tank transmitter. It was a hot afternoon in West Palm Beach, Florida. I was a young man of 20 or so, working in my unair-conditioned shop. The Florida heat was such that sweat was pouring from my body. I took my shirt off to try and cool down as I wrestled with this 30-pound boat anchor thing on my workbench. It was an old German tank transmitter that I had purchased for $25 at my local Army-Navy surplus store. It obviously came from Rommel and his German Desert Tank Corps, or so I assumed by the amount of dust and sand that covered it. At least that's what I imagined it to be. You know, the Germans lost that war in the desert, perhaps just because of this radio. This was a low-band VHF radio with a frequency range of 20 to 50 megahertz, and sometimes propagation distances, better known as skip, can be outstanding at those frequencies. Too much for Rommel and his boys in the desert, because their tank transmissions were being copied loud and clear on the other side of the world in Washington, D.C., much to Rommel's chagrin. Well, this bad boy was sitting on my countertop now, and it had been modified somewhere along the way from 12 or 24 volts DC to 115 volts AC. I had it plugged in and all the tubes were lit, but there was no output as I keyed the mic. And all the information on the radio was written in German, so it was not very helpful. But I could almost swear this was Rommel's personal command tank radio. I could almost see his fingers in the dust on this radio. But alas, it would not transmit a word, and I wondered why. I had removed the outside cover plates, exposing many beautifully laced cable runs, all covered with protective aged orange heavy-duty wax. Most of the wiring appeared to be color-coded, but it was still very hard to follow the wiring in a laced bundle. So what to do? I have to open these laced bundles up to get a better look. So I took a pair of small manicure scissors and began cutting the cable, the lacing of the cable. It was tough going. The lacing was very tight, and the wax was doing all it could to keep the bundle together. Well, I just cut to tried a little harder to get these scissors blades into the bundle so I can cut along and take the lace apart to be able to trace the wiring out. So here I am with my thumb and finger through the holes of this small pair of scissors, and I had moved over the transmitter now to get a better angle. My sweaty chest was laying on the frame, and suddenly everything went red. My body was vibrating violently. I had cut into, well, you know what, the high voltage, and then, so there you go. Well, 1 minute I was hanging over the radio, and the next minute, after I'd cut into that high voltage line, I was facing opposite from it. When I came to, I was still standing, but now turned away from the transmitter. And why was my body still vibrating so violently? And something else was wrong. I wasn't breathing. Apparently, it had been a perfect storm, my chest on the radio and my fingers through the scissor holes. Meanwhile, back to the not breathing part. I could think about breathing, but that's about it. I couldn't do it. My lungs were paralyzed from the shock. I also knew I had a limited time in that condition before I would pass out, maybe permanently. Then I began pounding myself in the chest with my fist, trying to restore my paralyzed lungs. And then slowly, ever so slowly, I could take a little gulp of air. About an hour later, I could breathe a little, but it hurt. A week later, I had recovered. In retrospect, my hasty decision was to start cutting into that cable bundle without first unplugging the radio and then shorting out the high voltage. The good side, I had escaped death. Barely. Later, much later, I dug a hole and buried that German transmitter, never for it to threaten anyone else's life. Well, this has been another thrilling edition of Adventures in Radioland. And there you go, something, one of the episodes of my life I'd just as soon forget, but it is one of those that, will help maybe somebody with their better approach to servicing equipment as far as not taking any chances, making sure it's unplugged, and shorting out the high voltage to make sure that the power supply doesn't come back to bite you. This is the Friday afternoon Qso-Vlog net. If you have a radio you want to check out, give me a shout.